After conspicuously avoiding any media appearances on Sunday, Starmer has hit a full round of interviews following his conference speech. It's fair to say he didn't get an easy ride.
You mentioned that you are dedicated to providing a government service for working people. You must have mentioned working people at least 13 times in your speech. What about the people who have worked all of their lives, paid into the state, pensioners? How can you justify taking away up to £300 from those formerly working people?
Well, it's tough. And I think the first thing to say is, and to explain, is why we had to do it. We inherited a really damaged economy. We did an audit and we discovered an undisclosed £22 billion black hole this year, which we have to fix.
That black hole includes public sector pay rises.
Well, the last government set up the pay review bodies for the public sector. It knew that they would come back with about £9 billion worth of recommendations. Some of those recommendations came back and the government put them on the desk and didn't deal with them. They ran away.
Okay.
But they allocated 0 pence towards that settlement. That is not the way to run the economy.
Why
so
do
I'm not going to accept this challenge.
Why do
that
pensioners
somehow
have to
by
pay?
paying that, because there's a £22 billion black hole.
Well, there's a £22 billion black hole. I hadn't heard about that before. You can see what the Labour strategists were thinking with this. They thought that this was, they were playing four-dimensional chess. What we're going to do, we're going to get into government, and we're going to talk loads and loads about what we've inherited from the Conservatives. So a bit like in the 2010s, people blame the previous guys for all the problems. So obviously, with the Conservatives in the 2010s, it was saying Labour overspent and that's why we got a financial crisis, even though that's not why we got a financial crisis. We got a financial crisis because there was irresponsible lending in the United States. But there we go. That's a different story, a different episode. They thought they could do the same trick. I think one of the reasons it's backfired is because, and again, you could be a bit cynical here, actually, because when the Tories did it, they said, Labour have given us this really terrible inheritance and we're going to attack really weak people. So they went after people on disability benefits, people who didn't have much of a voice. The Labour Party said, we want to tell everyone that it's the last guy's fault. And then they attacked a group of people who are actually politically very influential, pensioners, right? So this was, I don't know how they didn't see this coming, but this has been an absolute political disaster, which isn't going away. Susanna Reid also showed Starmer a clip of a Labour voting pensioner called Chrissy, who has arthritis. She fears that this winter she won't be able to afford to put on the heating.
Would you like to take this opportunity to say sorry to pensioners like Chrissy?
Well, I am really concerned that we've been put in this position. Mm-hmm. When you inherit an economy with £22 billion missing, it is a really difficult set of choices. But what I don't want to do is to allow the economy to run out of control. What I want to make sure is that every single pensioner, there is that increase through the triple lock each and every year, £460 next year because of the triple lock. We have to take that action, but I also have to fix the NHS. And talking to pensioners, so many of them want the NHS to work properly because they're dependent on it.
I just want to stick with this point about pensioners like Chrissy. And I asked you, would you like to take this opportunity to say sorry to voters who voted for you, like Chrissy, pensioners who are about to lose hundreds this winter because of your choices?
What I'd say to Chrissy is this. I absolutely promised that we would stabilise the economy to make sure we never had the economy getting out of control again. We then discovered £22 billion missing.
Just because I've asked you a couple of times and you have just skirted around it, I did ask, would you like to take this opportunity to say sorry to the pensioners who feel hurt and less well off, certainly not better off, because you've taken away their winter fuel allowance? Would you like to say sorry?
The people who should be saying sorry are the last government who left a hole of £22 billion. And they should be sorry for that. They should apologise for that.
I don't think Chrissy's going to be particularly persuaded by that. And this is the big problem because I suppose There are people in policy circles who like to means test stuff, who say that, if you're going to means test something, then the winter fuel allowance isn't a bad candidate because there are lots of wealthy pensioners. There are lots of wealthy pensioners out there who don't really need the £300. The problem is means testing is expensive, politically difficult, but also the pension credit is only received by quite a small, or a very small actually, proportion of pensioners. There are lots of people who don't quite qualify for pension credit, but who are still really struggling financially. Some of them, like Chrissy, have arthritis and are very terrified about going into this winter. So it was a mistake, and sorry seems to be the hardest word. I love that. Will you say sorry? I am very concerned. Not quite sorry, kind of close, but he won't admit that they've done anything wrong, and they don't want to admit a mistake this early in their term. That wasn't the only issue Starmer was asked to apologise for. LBC's Nick Ferrari had this.
We've just heard you say that we're all in this together. Service is the responsibility of power. Everything will be shared fairly. But as you know, this comes after day of negative headlines of how you and your senior colleagues have been in receipt of various gifts totaling tens of thousands of pounds. Why should my audience buy into what you've just said?
Well, look, Nick, I understand why questions are asked about things like donations. Some of my donations were things like clothes in the busy period running up to an election. I'm on the road, I'm focused on what I'm doing. People come forward and say I can help and make a donation towards clothes or something like that.
Why do you suppose they do that?
Well, I mean, in this particular case, it was a Labour peer, so he's got nothing to gain. He just wanted us to win the election, and that's why he did it. But look, Nick, let me be just really clear. I understand why you're asking me questions. And
we will move on from this, but we need to know.
That's important for me to say. Look, that was opposition. We're now in government, and therefore you won't be seeing any declarations from me in relation to clothing. Now we're in government. It's a different, we've turned a page, if you like.
Can you say, to use a footballing term, can you say sorry for an own goal?
Well, look, there was no breach of the rules or anything like that. We complied with everything.
But it has dominated part of this conference, and there is a cloud. So can you say, sorry, this was an own goal?
Look, Nick, I'm not going to apologise for not doing anything wrong, but I am going to recognise that you're asking me questions and people have asked questions. And I do understand
But if it's not doing anything wrong, why don't you carry on doing it?
Well, because I think, when you're running around in opposition, trying to just focus on winning that election, and people come forward and say, let me give you a bit of help with that, that's one thing. Now we're in government, that's another thing, which is why I've taken the decision, right or wrong, that I'm not going to be taking donations from clothes again.
The distinction seems a bit arbitrary. Of course, we were running around in opposition, and therefore you do take gifts from anyone when they offer them you. Now we're in government, we don't take gifts. I mean, if you're in opposition, they're still going to want favours, right? Because especially if you're ahead in the polls, they think you're going to be the next government. Why do you think they're doing it? I think in this situation, you could, because he says, I'm not going to apologise if I haven't done anything wrong, right? But obviously, I think 85% of the public now think he has done something wrong, or at least that sort of accepting these gifts is wrong. And you could quite easily fashion an apology here because you say, look, I was thinking about lots of things over those 5 years, and basically we were of the view, if we're not breaking the rules, then it must be fine. It's become apparent that obviously people do feel very differently about that. I respect that they feel differently about that. We actually should have gone above and beyond the rules, not just followed the rules. I assure them that this hasn't changed, how we will behave or act in government. But, given the reaction, I respect the British people. I'm not going to stand here and say I haven't done anything wrong if they think I have. It was, we followed the rules, but that's not always good enough. Fair enough. I think people would probably be fairly accepting of that. They might even sort of warm to the guy by saying, I'm not going to apologise because I haven't done anything wrong. And it's a little bit juvenile. Starmer is clearly desperate to put the freebies issue to bed and move on to other things. But yet another story has broken on this front. It concerns Starmer being gifted a 6-week stay at an £18 million penthouse during the general election. What's Starmer's excuse this time? That he had to take the freebie because his son needed somewhere quiet to study for his GCSEs. You may or may not find that a sympathetic argument, but there's one problem. The dates of the penthouse stay, which is recorded as being worth £20,000. They sort of had to put a somewhat arbitrary figure on it. I suppose maybe that's what it would have gone for on Airbnb. The dates they stayed there were from the 29th of May to the 13th of July this year. GCSE exams began on the 9th of May and were totally over and by the 19th of June. So they got at least 3 weeks in that gaff after their son had been doing his GCSEs. I suppose they were waiting to move into Downing Street.
There was the interview, and they desperately wanted Keir Starmer to say sorry. We're going to go specifically about the winter fuel payment, the one with Susanna Reid. And they're not going to do that. They're not going to apologise for this, fundamentally because, as you said, there are plenty of people who just really, really support means testing. I describe them as means testing fetishists because the idea to these people that somebody would get something that they don't need is far more egregious to them. Someone doesn't get something, someone doesn't, they have 2%. And something I just cannot get with. I cannot agree with that position at all. But that's the position that they take. So trying to get them to apologise for something that they did, that they support ideologically, that they also have justified as being necessary under the £22 billion black hole narrative they've gone with, they're never going to do it. There's no way they'd ever would do it. And so trying to bang on at them to do it, I think doesn't really have much weight to it. And that it's not just, something we were forced to do, like Liz Kendall saying, we didn't want to do it, but we've had to do it to try and take the 22 billion black hole the Tories have left us seriously. Ray Trues was banging on about this in 2014. Like, this isn't a new idea of their politics of deficit reduction to go around that narrative that they're trying to pull around this black hole. So again, they haven't picked up out of nowhere. It's not something they forced to have done. It's something they genuinely believe in and they have wanted to do for a very long time. There's no way you're going to get them to apologise. What I do find interesting, though, is that the press are desperate. They're desperate to get Keir Starmer to apologise for doing a policy they said they would do 10 years ago. Desperate to get him to apologise for, doing things which look pretty grubby but aren't breaking the rules. How many times do you think they found Conservative ministers and say, would you like to apologise for United Nations representatives saying that your government was violating the human rights of the disabled? Would you like to apologise for all of the additional excess deaths during the austerity regime? No decisions that were necessary for apologies from the Conservative government when they were in power. Yet the Labour government suddenly has to apologise for everything. Now, it's true. There should be scrutiny of the Labour government, and I'm glad finally Keir Starmer and his cronies are getting scrutinised by the media in a way that they really weren't in the run-up to the election. But it still does seem to me like things that are definitely worthy of scrutiny were never worthy of scrutiny under the Conservative Party when they both should be. As for this particular story about the penthouse, it really does feel like a kind of fly in the ointment at this point. We've heard so many of these different stories, and having access to a room that is obviously very expensive, rather than something that is like a new thing being bought with new money, rather than access to property that is not getting paid extra for, like they're not donating money, they're just having access to something that already exists. That doesn't make as much difference to me as plenty of the other donations and gifts that we've seen that have a tangible monetary value that wouldn't have existed had they not had this in with the Labour Party.
I think this is one of those stories, I've been thinking about this, a bit like Partygate, where actually, because people say this is a storm in a teacup being driven by the media, and in some level it is being driven by the media. But I think what's making the media keep reporting it sort of with such vigor is actually because it's making their viewers kind of more angry than they expected. So with Partygate, some of those stories when they first came out, I was a bit like, considering all of the things that have been going on over the past 2 years, this is not the thing that really makes me that angry, right? The parties didn't look that great. There were much bigger scandals during the COVID period, but it just made people mad, right? And I think understandably so, right? And that's what drove the media coverage. And I think this Giftgate thing is similar because journalists, there aren't actually that many careers where you do get free stuff, but journalism is one of them. Right. So I'm not a successful enough journalist to get offered many free stuff, but every now and again I get an email where it said, you want to come to this, press viewing of a play or whatever. I'm not there for work because I'm not going to write a review about it, but I might go to this press viewing of a play. And so I think there'll be lots of journalists who get a lot more freebies than I do, who sort of saw this story and they're like, oh, you know what, he got offered this freebie, his family wanted it, blah, blah, blah. I'm not that outraged by it, but they found that their viewers, their audience, were infuriated because it's actually very rare to have a job where people offer you free stuff and you're allowed to take it. I know if you're a teacher and if you get given a box of chocolates, you have to fill out a bunch of forms. If you work in the NHS, you have to do the same. There was a story about a street cleaner where some people had raised some money on GoFundMe so that he could go on holiday. And the private company who hired this guy said that wasn't allowed because it would be tantamount to corruption. So this story, I don't think, is being driven by the press. I think it's being driven by sort of like an outrage and an anger from the public that Labour were completely sort of out of touch about how this would read to most people, as were most journalists. So I think this has almost been a bit of a surprise to everyone. And yeah, Labour probably should have realised earlier that this would piss people off. And I think probably they are going to have to apologise at some point because they have got this massively wrong. There is another scandal brewing. This is one that seems to provoke less anger among the public, although the one that, you know, a journalist like me is maybe a bit more interested in. That's because Labour have appointed former climate chief Rachel Kite as climate envoy, a role which was previously axed by Rishi Sunak. And this is what's interesting here. Kite is currently co-chair of the Climate Advisory Board of Quadrature Climate Foundation. We talked about that yesterday. That's linked to Quadrature Hedge Fund. Quadrature is the fund that recently gave Labour a £4 million donation just as the general election was called, but which was only revealed last week. Some of this story is a bit of a red herring. So they've been sort of talked about this company that invests lots of money in fossil fuels. They are a hedge fund that sort of seems to do their investments via algorithms, and they could be betting against as many oil companies as they are betting for. So they're not necessarily, you know, they won't be lobbying the government to give concessions for oil companies, for example. But if you are a Cayman Islands-based hedge fund, there will be lots of policies that you will be in favour of. You know, transparency in tax havens, probably they're not going to be in favour of. And the fact that they donated Labour £4 million before the election, and now someone who's very much connected to their company has been given a plummy job. You know, it might be the case that the guys who are at that hedge fund really care about climate change. This woman is clearly, you know, qualified for this kind of job if she was at the UN, I think it was before. But it stinks, doesn't it? You get a £4 million donation before the election, which you get in that 1 week window, which means that you don't have to declare it until 3 months later. And then someone from that offshore tax haven hedge fund gets a plummy job in your administration.